Alright, so you want some high-stake thriller manga recommendations. Well, you've come to the right place, because I've rounded up around a dozen or so incredible titles that I think are extremely binge-worthy. But, just in case you don't know what this genre is, you can basically think of it like Squid Game or The Hunger Games, where the situations these characters have been put into offer high suspense, emotional roller coasters, and a little bit of intellectual stimulation. Okay, but guys, I don't want to do manga recommendation videos the normal way. I could just sit here and list off a bunch of manga names, but what I really want to do is make the process of figuring out exactly what to read next so much easier. And I thought a fun way to do it would be through this flowchart I made, so you can really filter down what sounds interesting to you. And as we go through it, I'll be giving out awards for what I think are the top 3 manga of the bunch. Alright, so starting off, I've categorized these manga into 2 general categories, either as death games or as gambling manga. And if I'm being honest, I think most of you were probably here for the death game, so I'll be going down that path first. But don't worry, if you're more interested in gambling, I have chapters listed down below, so feel free to skip around to whatever's most interesting. So now, going down the death game path, we get to our first choice, which is, do you want it to be a supernatural story or more realistic? So now, when we look at supernatural death games, we can further split it up into 2 different categories. Do you want it to be combat focused, or do you want it to be survival focused? Now, if you're a shonen fan, you probably love combat, so let's go down that path first. And so I can finally start giving you manga recommendations for death game manga that are supernatural and combat focused. Okay, the first combat recommendation that I have for you is called Darwin's Game. Darwin's Game follows the life of Kaname Sudo, a high school student who unwittingly becomes a player in a deadly mobile game brought to life, known as the Darwin's Game, where players are set up to fight and kill each other to win special rewards. As you can probably guess, Darwin's Game is based off Darwin's theory of natural selection, where only the fittest can survive. But in a world where everybody has superpowers, that means nobody is super. So the characters actually have to use strategy in order to survive, and the characters that only rely on their powers are usually the first to die. In this story, Kaname is determined to uncover the mysteries behind the game's creators and the true purpose of Darwin's Game. Okay, the second combat story that I'll be talking about is called High-Rise Invasion. And High-Rise Invasion is kind of a different story than most of the other ones on this list because it's not exactly a death game story, or at least that's not how it starts. This manga definitely starts off as more of a survival-focused story, where the premise is that our main character, Yuri Honjo, wakes up after being kidnapped and finds herself in the middle of an eerie building. Her first sight is seeing a masked man chop open some poor guy's skull with a hatchet. Terrified, Yuri runs away, but encounters even more masked men throughout the building, and while avoiding them, she ends up running to the top of the building. Looking around, she realizes that she's no longer in Tokyo, but instead, she's in some unknown city that is filled with pretty much only high-rise buildings, and weirdly enough, all of them are each connected to each other through suspension bridges at the roofs. The story starts off with Yuri's fight for survival in this weird world, but as the story goes on and the mystery picks up, a bunch of high-intensity superpowers come into play, and she finds herself in the middle of a deathly battle royale. I really wanted to include this manga because I think that it gives off a lot of the same vibes as these other stories when it comes to being a psychological, high-suspense thriller. Okay, and the third manga that I have in the combat bucket is called Mirai Nikki, or Future Diary. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about this one, but it's so iconic I just had to include it. When it comes to anime tropes, you're probably familiar with the concept of a tsundere, which is when there's a character who's sometimes really harsh with you and sometimes really lovey-dovey with you. Also known as my girlfriend, before and after I give her chocolate. Tsunderes are pretty common to find, but an anime trope that isn't as common is the concept of a yandere, which is when a character loves you to the point of obsession. They are excessively possessive with you and will go as far as to behave in some pretty messed up ways to maintain their love. I don't speak Japanese, but from what I understand, the yan in yandere comes from the Japanese verb that means to be mentally sick. Mirai Nikki features the poster girl for yandere characters, who is someone that can truly show off her dangerous tendencies while she competes along with her crush in an intense death game. Like, literally, when you search yandere, she's the main picture on the Wikipedia page. Mirai Nikki follows a group of 12 people selected as candidates to be the next god. Each are given a future diary, which gives them glimpses into the future, but only one can survive at the end. In Mirai Nikki, we follow the story of a timid main character named Yuki as he survives through this game of death, while also being supported by and competing against a girl named Yuno, who is the ultimate yandere. And if you like psychological stories like this, then you're probably going to love the seinen version of this genre. And now, this list I've made today only covers shonen titles, but don't worry, I'll be making a follow-up video for seinen titles soon. So if you're interested, feel free to subscribe and keep a lookout. And so now backing up, we can go down the survival tree. And the first choice here is, do you want it to be mystery focused or do you want it to be game focused? And when I say mystery focused, don't get me wrong. Pretty much all the stories on this list are going to have some element of mystery to them. But the biggest difference here is that when I say mystery focused, I'm referring to ones that have a defined mystery right from the start, where each new game progressively unlocks another layer to the mystery. And so let's go down the mystery path. In this mystery section, I have one major recommendation for you and one honorable mention. The main manga recommendation I have for you is called Enigma, which was actually in Weekly Shonen Jump and was a great example of using superpowers more for puzzles and not for fighting. Do you remember that one character from JoJo who had the power of whatever they draw would inevitably come true? Well, that's the same kind of power that our main character Haiba Sumio has. With his power, when he sleeps, he'll occasionally write into a diary, and when he wakes up and sees the diary, whatever he's written down will come true. And as a quick side note, it's incredibly funny to me that JoJo's prediction power accidentally ended up predicting 9/11. But anyway, one day, Sumio wakes up to find out that he predicted his mom would get kidnapped, and it ends up coming true. But before he can investigate, Sumio ends up getting kidnapped too, and wakes up to find himself with a bunch of other students who were also kidnapped and put into an alternative version of his high school. And soon enough, they find out that they'll be forced to compete in several mysterious challenges that will ultimately let them leave the school, but if they fail, they'll be trapped there forever. I think the combination of superpowers for puzzle solving as well as the overall dark mystery was incredibly entertaining, and I definitely recommend this one. The honorable mention that I have here is Danganronpa. And the reason Danganronpa is only an honorable mention is because if you're gonna get into Danganronpa, don't do it through the manga. Do yourself a favor and play the visual novel. I think Danganronpa is an extremely fun, extremely interesting premise of a bunch of high schoolers playing this murder mystery style game. And because of that, I wanted to make sure to include it on this list, if only for an honorable mention. So be sure to check it out if you're interested. Alright, so now instead of the mystery focused stories, let's look at the game focused survival stories. And down this path, there's one final choice you have to make. Do you want it to be romance focused or not romance focused? And this romance focused story is one of my favorites, so let's take a look at it. Okay, now the romance survival game focused story that I have for you is called Alice in Borderland. And I was actually introduced to Alice in Borderlands through the live action adaptation. And the live action adaptation was so good that I didn't even know it was from a manga until I looked it up afterwards. In this manga, after a bright light occurs in the middle of Shibuya Crossing, thousands of people wake up to find themselves in a version of Tokyo that has become completely barren. Soon, the characters find out that once every few days, they'll be forced to compete in seemingly endless death games. Alice in Borderland immediately sets up a mystery of how the characters got to this place, what are the purpose of these games, and what do friendships and relationships mean in a place where anyone can die on any given day. Between the manga and the live-action adaptation, which featured completely different sets of games, Alice in Borderland has become my second favorite manga on this list. And now, going back to the romance choice, let's look at the ones that are non-romance focused. And looking down this path, I have two recommendations for you and one honorable mention. And now to start off the path, I wanted to talk about As the Gods Will. As the Gods Will actually features half of the games that are actually played in Squid Game, but the crazy thing is, it did it 10 years earlier. This manga features some familiar games such as Red Light Green Light, Tug of War, or walking over a floating platform to determine which steps are safe, and if you fail, then you fall and die. But the main difference here is that Squid Game is pretty realistic with the way the games are played, but As the Gods Will is definitely very supernatural. I mean, the premise here is that God has descended upon humanity and is determined to find the next god by having high schoolers across the world compete against each other in deathly games. Now, I wanted to mention that this manga is actually made up of two parts, but instead of having part 2 be a sequel, it's actually more like two stories that are happening simultaneously from two different characters. You may have heard of the Star Wars machete order, which says that you should watch 4 and 5 first, then watch 2 and 3, and then 6 at the end, so you get the biggest emotional impact out of Darth Vader and Anakin. Similarly, I'm going to mention my own machete order for As the Gods Will. I think you should start by reading the first 80 chapters of part 2, then go back and read all of part 1, and then finally, go back to where you left off in part 2. I think nobody else has talked about this order, but I think this is the best order for getting the most emotional impact out of the story. I don't think the story is perfect, but I think it was really entertaining, and I actually liked what they did with the ending. So I would say overall, As the Gods Will is probably tied for my third favorite manga on this list. Okay, now the other manga recommendation that I have for you in this bucket is called Real Account. Real Account is kind of an exaggerated twist on a concept that we probably all know. Social media is no longer just about sharing your life with friends, but has also kind of become about sharing your life with the world and trying to maximize the amount of followers you get. This death game story takes advantage of that concept by one day mysteriously teleporting tons of users of a social media platform called Real Account into a virtual world. In this world, players are forced to compete in deathly games, where if you die in the video game, you die in real life. But the catch here is that followers of yours on social media will also die. Now, the good thing for the followers is that they can unfollow you at any point, but the downside is that if a player reaches 0 followers, then they automatically die. So if any of your followers actually care about you, they'll put their life on the line to support you. This story kind of explores the idea of what real friendships and real connections are about, and that most of the followers that we get on social media don't actually care about us. I do think that the story is kind of exaggerated with this concept, but I get where it's coming from. Okay guys, the honorable mention that I have for you is Yu-Gi-Oh! And of course, a lot of you I'm sure already know Yu-Gi-Oh! As the extremely famous card game and anime about playing cards, but what I think a lot of people don't know is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually originally started off as a manga that wasn't even about cards. Act 1 of the manga was actually a pretty dark death game style story, and it was only in Act 2 that the card game started to be played. I think the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga has held up super well, and I definitely recommend you check it out. Alright, so now we can go way back, all the way back to the choice on if you want a supernatural or realistic story. And now we can start looking at the realistic stories. I only have one option for you here to figure out which of the two realistic death game stories you want. And that choice is, do you care about the power of friendship, or would you rather see friends hate each other? If you're a shonen fan, then you have to believe in the power of friendship. So let's go down that path first. And in that route, we have Tomodachi game. Tomodachi game offers a pretty unique twist on the high-stakes thriller genre. Most stories in this genre usually have the characters competing against one another, often forming short alliances, but ultimately having everyone fend for themselves. And in that sense, the interesting part is seeing the psychology of these characters who are fighting to survive. But in Tomodachi game, the premise is all about the term Tomodachi, or friendship. In this story, all the challenges revolve around how much you can trust your friends. While it may seem obvious to be able to trust your best friends in a high-pressure situation, when it comes to potentially being millions of dollars in debt if someone betrays you, it's easy for these friend groups to fall apart. That's right, in Tomodachi game, groups of friends compete with each other where one of these friends is usually in severe debt. By playing together, the friends can help eliminate that debt for their friend, or even win money at the end. But if the team loses, then that massive debt is split among all the friends. An uncommon twist in these games is that if a friend does betray the group, then they'll be free of the debt and only the other ones will be cursed with it. Now, I know that this isn't technically a death game because nobody really dies from any of these games, but it's pretty often mentioned that losing these games is just as bad as death. The logic here is that by suddenly going millions and millions into debt, your life is basically over. And I think that out of all the high-stakes thrillers on this flowchart, Tomodachi game is definitely my #1 favorite. I think that the main cast of characters are actually pretty well developed and is a lot more to them than you would think. And the main character especially is actually a competent genius, and it's really fun to see him balance his strategic thinking with his belief in his suspicious friends. Alright, so now let's go down the other path of stories where the friends end up just hating each other. Well, the recommendation that I have for you here is the Doubt series. Doubt revolves around a group of friends who are lured into playing a popular mobile game called Rabbit Doubt. However, they soon find themselves in a real-life version of the game where one of them is the wolf in sheep's clothing, and the others must discover the traitor among them to survive. The group is confined to an abandoned building, and a chilling atmosphere of distrust and fear sets in as they attempt to expose the traitor while trying to avoid gruesome deaths. While all these death game manga are dark to some extent, even within these, Doubt is among the most dark when it comes to the psychological horror, mystery, and suspense that it builds up with its unsettling story. Now, I will be honest, Doubt is the manga that honestly I think kinda sucks. I think the character relationships are pretty shallow, I think the mystery ends up falling kinda flat, I think it's kinda contrived, I don't think the twists are great, but it is pretty popular in my anime list, so maybe it's just a me thing. Definitely check it out and let me know. It's pretty short, so you can read it in just a couple hours. And the reason that I've called this the Doubt series is because the author has actually put out a couple different titles that follow a similar premise. It's not the same cast or anything, but it's the same type of story. So if you're a fan of Doubt, you'll probably like those too. Alright, so that pretty much covers all the death games, so now we can rewind back to the first choice and go down the gambling tree. Alright, so the first question I have for you here is pretty simple. Do you want to see some boobies or do you not want to see some boobies? And as a viewer of this channel, I'm sure you've got some fine taste, so I'm sure you want to see the ones that have the biggest plot. So going down the boobie path, I have one final choice for you. Do you want a crazy male protagonist or a crazy female protagonist? Now, let's say you want a crazy male protagonist. My recommendation for you here is Gamblefish. In most of these stories, we find our characters being tricked into playing these high-stakes games and figuring out a way to survive despite the circumstances. But in Gamblefish, our main character Tom is a master gambler and specifically attended a prestigious high school of rich kids with the intention of facing the elites and gambling his way to the top. But the intentions of why Tom wants to bring ruin to all the elites in this school is a mystery, and as the story continues and the gambles get more and more crazy with more insane stakes, so too does the mystery surrounding the school and why Tom chose to go there in the first place. Now, within the flowchart, in order to get to Gamblefish, I told you that this would have a crazy male main character. And just to give you an example of how crazy this bastard is, let me show you an example of what he was willing to wager in one of the early chapters. During one round of a game of blackjack, Tom decides to use his fingers as part of the gamble. And normally you'd be like, oh, something like him losing his finger would never happen, there's too much plot armor. But literally right after this, Tom gets his finger cut off, and then after a quick pause, he gets right back up and wagers even more of his fingers for the next round. Oh yeah, and as a closing note for this manga, for some reason Obama's in it. Now going back, let's say you want a crazy female protagonist. My recommendation for you here is Kakegurui. Now, if you're looking for a story that's kind of similar to Gamblefish in premise, but goes even further with the gambling concept, then Kakegurui has got you covered. Kakegurui centers around a private high school where the #1 factor for success is your skill at gambling. Students are ranked by their monetary contributions to the student council, which fuels a system where the students are ruthlessly betting fortunes against one another in order to get to the top of the hierarchy. And those who suck at gambling are doomed to become slaves at the whim of the rest of the student body. But our main character is a beautiful girl who honestly doesn't even care about any of that and is just a gambling addict. She loves the thrill of gambling and is excellent at it and is eager to take on the intense gambling world at this high school. Alright, now going back, if you're looking for a gambling story that doesn't really have any ecchi elements to it, then you should check out Gambling Emperor Legend Zero. This manga is created by the legendary author Nobuyuki Fukumoto, who is renowned for his other gambling stories like Akagi and Kaiji. Over the past few decades, this man has basically pioneered the genre of high-stakes thrillers. This time, for Gambling Emperor Legend Zero, he's adapted his skill for the shonen audience, and by doing so, has brought a pretty fast-paced approach to his high-intensity gambling format. Now, one of the major differences between Fukumoto's series is in the main character. The main character, Zero, is someone who is definitely more shonen-esque, as he's someone that loves to give back to the poor and is very empathetic towards his friends. But that empathetic aspect of his also means that he's a genius that can make mistakes by believing in his friends too much at the wrong moments. A great example of this is a game that's played pretty early on called the quarter jump game. In this game, Zero is put onto an elevated platform and blindfolded. He's told that he must jump from any one side over a gap that can get onto another platform. But the catch here is that only one side has a safe platform, and the other 3 sides will have him falling to his death. But an additional layer here is that each side is filled with other players who each win if they convince him to jump to their side. And a few of these players are people that Zero is friends with, but unbeknownst to Zero are trying to kill him so that they can be the ones to win the game. The actual story is that at some point in the future, pretty much all the billionaires of this world are going to be competing against each other in a huge gambling tournament. But before that tournament starts, a billionaire from Japan decides to have a bunch of Japanese people compete against each other to determine who is the best Japanese gambler. If they end up being selected for the huge billionaire gambling tournament and win, they can potentially win 1 trillion yen. With that huge amount of money on the line, Zero is determined to win and give that money back to all of the people of Japan who've gone into debt because of scammers. Overall, Gambling Emperor Legend Zero is tied for my 3rd favorite manga on this list, and I think it's a great introduction to the legendary works by this incredible author. Now, that pretty much covers all of the high-stakes thriller shonen stories that I wanted to talk about. I think this is a super exciting genre, and there's so many hours of content that you can go through with all of these manga. And if you're looking for even more manga recommendations, well, I've got a video that'll keep you covered with a few more incredible titles somewhere on the screen. Let me know what your favorite is down below, and if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.